Thank you very much for asking me to be here to think about the men still in Guantanamo and to... Moism knows no one ever hears me, so... He had years of being trained under interrogation. I haven't quite had the same experience. In fact, Moism was my first news, not of Guantanamo, because he hadn't yet arrived there and wouldn't for another year. But that was the first I knew that things were happening that were beyond our imagining. I had a phone call from a close friend of his and said his father just heard from him. He's been abducted. He still had a phone. He was in the back of a car. This was in Pakistan on January the 31st. And so I knew about it on February the 1st, 2002. And then soon after, quite soon after, a young man, Shafiq Rasul, came to my office and said that he had had a visit from a Sunday newspaper, the newspaper of choice for the intelligence services, to say that they had been told his brother was somewhere called Guantanamo Bay. And this young man had been doing a political science course in which his particular area of study had been the wrongful convictions of Irish men and women many years before. And so he thought this must be a wrongful conviction. And so he thought he'd better find a lawyer here, or lawyers, who could do something. But it wasn't a conviction. Of course it was not a conviction. It was kidnapping, rendition, torture. But by chance, just as we were looking for lawyers to bring a challenge in America, because we found, of course, this was America, and Guantanamo was an American base in Cuba. As we were looking for lawyers in America who could challenge this, was it challengeable? Was it an offshore island deliberately chosen to be outside American jurisdiction? Yes, of course it was. But as we were looking for lawyers, there were lawyers in America looking for a named person, because you couldn't bring an action on behalf of what you'd heard of, groups of unnamed, unknown individuals. And so that's how it was that Shafiq Rasul brought an action. He didn't know for years he was bringing it, but his family brought it. Rasul v. Bush, v. George W. Bush. And some years later, Rasul won. And his victory, hard to think it's a victory when it was so hard for men to leave, and men still there now. But it was a victory of sorts, because the one thing it did do was establish the right for lawyers to go in to Guantanamo Bay and to meet the people that they've been asked to represent. Now, all that meant, and the law has been largely useless in the face of state criminality, all it meant was, for the first time, people could go in and hear what was happening, see what was happening, to an extent, see what was happening. And so thus it was that the crumbs of information began to come out of the true horror of what had happened, how men had been seized here, there, and everywhere, transported in chains, shackled, gagged, in chains, sitting in rows, like men and women had been transported in slave ships across the Atlantic too, centuries before. And so it was that little by little the true horrors began to come out. And then a pitched battle through the courts here with the feeble mechanism of law attempting to force the return one by one of British citizens and British residents, and so to use an action against the British government for what became more and more clear was British complicity. And so the first men to come out, very young men, teenagers, had been taken. 3 young men from Tipton, who came out in a way accidentally because they had been tortured into confessing that they were the 3 men sitting with Osama bin Laden in a video they were shown. It was only as a matter of accident that the date on the video turned out to be precisely a time one of the young men was working in Curry's in Tipton and another was on probation in the West Midlands. But for that, perhaps they might be still there. Little by little, and one by one or 2 by 2, it was a massive campaign in this country that led to return. It wasn't law. Law is just a tool to try and achieve what pressure can be achieved on the state. But in this case, there were, if those were high-value detainees in Guantanamo, then they had high-value campaigners here. And one of the most important was Moisem's father, Mr. Begg, who just took on a mission and kept on going until his son came back. And when his son came back, he said, "I didn't know my father could do that. I didn't know he was a public speaker." Well, he wasn't to begin with, but he was a voice of extraordinary strength and influence, together with all the other voices that forced, one by one, the return. Some of them took longer than others. The non-British citizens, the residents. Britain said, "We won't have them back. They don't belong here." British citizens we may be forced to take back, yes, maybe, graciously, we'll take our own citizens back, but no, not the people who were living here, had families here, children at school here, no, we won't take them. But for 2 of them, they made a fairly catastrophic mistake in the courts when we brought an action for Bisha al-Rawi and Jamil al-Banna to say, you, the intelligence services, were complicit in their rendition. They were businessmen, gone to set up a business in Gambia to do with peanut oil. And they were abducted there and taken to the dark prison in Afghanistan, tortured, and then to Guantanamo. But we said, you caused them to be arrested. You asked for them to be arrested in the court documents. And stupidly, in reply, they said, we didn't arrest them. We didn't ask for them to be arrested, and produced telegrams. And the telegram said to external intelligence agencies, namely the USA, these men are travelling on this plane to the Gambia. This is the time of the flight. They are believed to be Islamic extremists. They are believed to be carrying an improvised explosive device. That's what they said. But we knew, because they had been detained first before being put on the plane with their improvised explosive device, that they had been detained in Paddington Green, near here, police station. And the explosive device had turned out to be a battery charger. But the stupidity of asserting, thinking that this would show that we in this country were not responsible for their detention and rendition, was so extravagantly idiotic that the embarrassment caused those two non-British citizens to be the first non-British citizens to return. Now, could it happen today? Would it happen? Could it? Well, just think of it. What about the British citizens, for a start? The three Tipton lads, Moisim. Wouldn't the first thing this country now do would be to strip them of their citizenship? A concept that actually hadn't been thought of at the time. Rendition, torture, were not topics that we ever thought we would be familiar with debating. And in fact, when the growth of extraordinary executive orders was growing and men were interned in this country, that means locked up indefinitely without trial. At this very time, post 9/11, a dozen men locked up, detained indefinitely, that means potentially forever, without trial, on the basis of secret evidence. Just like Guantanamo, we could not get the concept into our head. How could this be? This is not what is done. This was outlawed centuries ago. We do not use torture. We do not kidnap people. We do not lock them up indefinitely without trial, and yet we were doing it. And we're still doing it. And we have grown more and more and more to use secret evidence. And so if it were in some shape or form to be happening now, then would that same momentum be built up to bring people back? It's maybe one thing to beat a patriotic drum and say these are British citizens. And in fact, the turning point in terms of public intent to bring men back came when Moisim and Faraz Abbasi, the first to be put before a military commission and charged, the first of the first five. The Americans, no doubt thinking they would be pleasing the British, because these were people Britain had said covertly it certainly didn't want back. Not what they said publicly, what they said privately. But they went one step beyond what the public appetite could take. They said, we're building a death facility So if there are convictions before the Guantanamo courts, we'll be ready to execute people. In this country, we are bound by the European Convention of Human Rights that we do not send people to a death penalty. We abolished the death penalty in this country many years ago, and that struck a nerve, and there was a uniting of the Daily Mail, the Guardian, of the right and the left, of a patriotic reaction in relation to British citizens. But what would we do now? Most recently, the mother of a man held in Syria discovered that this country had agreed to suspend its objection to the death penalty and to send evidence to America so that he and another young man could be charged, convicted, and executed there. And the mother of that young man has been fighting through the courts here to establish that that goes counter to everything that we believed could never, ever happen here. And so this is where we are. This is where we are. And the slippage in ability to react, not just to injustice, but to state criminality sustained and perpetuated, in a way we get numbed, we get calloused, and our ability to be shocked diminishes. We become used to it. And so Guantanamo is still there. It's an extraordinary victory that the return to many countries of many men was achieved. But it's still there, and what it stands for is still there. And that's the state in which we live, in this, ironically, in this 21st century, we still have the concept of the nation state, that the state protects us, therefore we owe the state our loyalty. And so we haven't achieved a nation state, or between us in the world, nation states that police each other. Instead, with rare exceptions, they're complicit. So this message is a bleak one, but to say the capacity to be shocked is important. And if we're shocked, the necessity, just as Chris was saying, to remind ourselves, we just can't let it leave there. We can't let it rest there. And so thank you to Cage and all they do to just keep beating the drum. It's still there, Guantanamo is still there. Everything it represents, as well as who's there, and how the fight for them to be dealt with in a just way is a fight still even beginning, let alone getting near the end. But thank you very much for letting me come this evening. Thank you.